What is it, Laura? The essay?
It's not an essay. Not like Mary.
It's not supposed to be like Mary. She's older than you are. She knows more words.
I know lots of words, Ma. Trouble is, they're in my head.
Little House.
Here's a question that might ruin your childhood nostalgia in the next 30 seconds. What if I told you that Little House on the Prairie, one of the most wholesome shows ever put on American television, was once legally treated the same way as an R-rated movie in another country? Not because of violence. Not because of anything you'd expect. And that's just the beginning of a much bigger story about this beloved series that almost nobody talks about honestly. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly why this gentle little show about a pioneer family keeps getting dragged into some of the most heated conversations in television history, and why the real story is actually stranger and more complicated than any rumor about banned episodes. Let's start with the basics. Little House on the Prairie ran on NBC from 1974 to 1983, based loosely on the real childhood of author Laura Ingalls Wilder. It followed the Ingalls family as they moved across the American frontier in the late 1800s, facing blizzards, fires, sickness, and heartbreak, all while holding on to faith, family, and hard work. For generations of viewers, it became a symbol of a simpler, gentler kind of storytelling, the kind of show parents felt completely safe leaving on for their kids. And for the most part, that reputation is deserved. But here's the thing you need to understand right away, because a lot of videos online get this wrong. There is no official ban on any Little House on the Prairie episode in the United States. No network document, no court order, no government ruling has ever pulled a specific episode from circulation. If you've seen claims about episodes with dramatic names being quietly erased from syndication because of secret controversies, treat that with real skepticism. The actual story is less like a conspiracy and a lot more like a slow, decades-long argument about how a beloved piece of American culture should be remembered, and that argument is honestly more interesting than any fake ban. So, where does all this ban talk actually come from? Let's go to the strangest and most factual piece of it first, because it's almost too weird to make up. Little House on the Prairie was, at one point, officially labeled off-limits to minors in Finland. Not for violence. Not for language. It happened because of a home video distribution mix-up, where the studio releasing the DVDs in Finland failed to properly submit the show for a content rating exemption that family programming usually receives. Under Finnish law at the time, anything without that exemption defaulted to an adult rating. So Little House on the Prairie DVDs sold in Finland had to carry a sticker reading banned for under 18s, purely as a bureaucratic technicality. Meanwhile, the actual show kept airing weekly on Finnish public television, completely unaffected because broadcast television and home video releases fell under different rules. It's a genuinely bizarre footnote, and it has nothing to do with the show's content being scandalous. It's a paperwork problem that turned into an urban legend. Now, let's talk about where the real, substantive criticism actually lives, because this is where things get genuinely important. The deepest and most consistent controversy around Little House on the Prairie isn't really about the television series at all. It's about the original books the show is based on, written by Laura Ingalls Wilder herself. And this is where I want to be very direct with you, because sanitizing this part would defeat the whole point of the video. In the original text of Little House on the Prairie, the novel, Wilder wrote a line describing the frontier land the family settled on as having no people, only Indians. That phrasing was later revised in some editions to no settlers, but the original wording reflected a mindset that treated indigenous nations as if they weren't fully people occupying their own land. Elsewhere in the book series, a character says the phrase "the only good Indian is a dead Indian," a genuinely brutal line lifted from real historical rhetoric used to justify violence against Native Americans during that era. And in a later book in the series, Little Town on the Prairie, there's a passage depicting a minstrel show, complete with characters in blackface, presented without any critical framing, simply as a fun community event. These aren't rumors. These passages exist in the actual published books, and scholars, indigenous advocates, and literary historians have been writing about them for decades. This is the material that led the American Library Association to make a genuinely historic decision in 2018. For years, one of the ALA's most prestigious honors for children's literature was called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. In 2018, the organization voted to strip her name from that award entirely, officially citing what they described as dated cultural attitudes toward Indigenous people and people of color that contradict the values the award is supposed to represent. Think about how significant that is. This wasn't a random internet campaign or a single outraged blog post. This was the largest library association in the country making a formal, deliberate decision to separate an author's legacy from an award meant to celebrate literary excellence, specifically because of how her work portrayed Native Americans and Black Americans. And it's worth sitting with that for a second, because the reaction to the ALA's decision wasn't unanimous either. Some literary historians argued that renaming the award wasn't about punishing Wilder as a person, but about making sure a modern honor for excellence in children's literature didn't carry the name of someone whose most famous work contains language that actively dehumanizes entire groups of people. Others pushed back, arguing that judging a 19th-century memoirist by today's standards erases the historical value of her work as a first-hand account of frontier life. Both sides agree on one thing, though, which is that the passages themselves are real, documented, and still sitting in print on shelves in bookstores and libraries around the world right now. Nobody is disputing what the books actually say. The disagreement is entirely about what we should do with that information today, which is a very different kind of controversy than a secret ban. It's also worth mentioning that the books have faced real, concrete removals in specific places, even if the series as a whole was never banned nationwide. Some individual school districts and classrooms have pulled Little House on the Prairie from required reading lists over the years, specifically citing the passages describing Native Americans. These decisions were made locally, district by district, rather than through any single sweeping national policy, which is part of why the story around the show gets so muddled online. A book being removed from one specific classroom in one specific state gets exaggerated over time into rumors about the entire franchise being banned everywhere, when the reality is far more localized and, frankly, far more mundane than the rumor makes it sound. So that's the books. What about the television series specifically, the one most of us actually grew up watching? This is where it gets more nuanced, because the show didn't simply copy the book's most offensive lines onto the screen. But researchers who've actually sat down and studied the show episode by episode have found something worth talking about. One academic analysis looking at the full run of the series found that out of the show's total run of episodes, only a small handful, roughly a dozen or so, even reference Native American characters or themes at all. And within that small handful, the pattern researchers identified wasn't exactly flattering. Native characters were frequently sidelined into supporting roles where they existed mainly to help or be outsmarted by the white main characters, reinforcing old stereotypes about who gets to be the hero of the story. Some storylines leaned on what scholars call the noble savage trope, portraying Native characters as tragic, mystical, or doomed, rather than as fully realized people with their own agency and complexity. And like a lot of television from that era, non-Native actors were sometimes cast to play Native American roles, a casting practice that was common across the industry at the time, but is now widely recognized as a real problem because it took opportunities and authentic representation away from Native performers and often resulted in less accurate, more stereotyped portrayals. None of this means every episode of the show is offensive, and it definitely doesn't mean the show deserves to be erased or hidden away. What it means is that this beloved series was made in a very different era, by people who, however good their intentions might have been, were working within an industry that hadn't yet learned how to tell these stories with real care and consultation. And that's actually a useful thing to understand because it explains something else that's happening right now in real time with this exact franchise. Netflix recently greenlit a new adaptation of Little House on the Prairie, and the creative team behind it has been remarkably open about wanting to fix exactly the issues we've just been talking about. The showrunner has spoken publicly about deliberately reworking the portrayal of Indigenous characters, moving away from the nameless, background presence they had in earlier versions and giving them names, storylines, and real depth. The production has cast Indigenous actors in these roles, including actors from Ojibwe and Osage backgrounds, since the real Ingalls family story took place partly on Osage land. Actors involved in the new series have spoken about wanting to avoid continuing what they've called the erasure of indigenous peoples that shaped so much earlier frontier storytelling, this one included. Even the character of Ma, who in the original books shows clear apprehension and prejudice toward her native neighbors, has reportedly been given a more complicated, evolving relationship with indigenous characters in this new version, rather than simply glossing over that history. This matters because it shows you something important. The people actually working on this franchise today aren't pretending the old criticism doesn't exist. They're treating it as something to learn from and correct, which is a pretty strong signal that the concerns raised by scholars, indigenous advocates, and readers over the years weren't overblown or invented. They were real enough that an entire new production team built their approach around addressing them directly. It's a pretty striking contrast when you line the two versions up side by side. The original series, for all its warmth, largely treated its native characters as occasional guests in someone else's story, background figures who showed up for an episode or two and then quietly disappeared without much explanation, which is exactly the pattern researchers have pointed to when they talk about erasure in frontier storytelling. The new adaptation is explicitly trying to do the opposite, building out an ongoing presence for indigenous characters across the whole season rather than treating them as a one-off plot device. The showrunner has talked about wanting to show the lived experience of the people whose land the Ingalls family was actually moving through, since historically that's exactly what was happening, a white family repeatedly settling on land that was already inhabited. That's a meaningfully different starting point than the original series ever had, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened because the criticism landed, and somebody in a position to make creative decisions actually listened to it. So where does that leave fans of the original show, the ones so many of us grew up loving? Honestly, it leaves people pretty divided, and both sides of that divide make points worth hearing. Some longtime fans feel protective of the series and worried that focusing too much on its flaws risks erasing what the show got right, its portrayal of resilience, family bonds, and hard-earned faith during genuinely difficult times. They'd rather see the show preserved as it is, treated as a product of its era, with its flaws openly discussed rather than hidden. Other viewers, including many indigenous voices, argue that constantly rearing content with these stereotypes, without context or acknowledgement, allows harmful ideas to keep circulating unchallenged, generation after generation, especially for young viewers who won't necessarily know to question what they're seeing. There isn't really a clean, satisfying answer to that disagreement, and I don't think pretending there would be honest. What we can say is that nothing about Little House on the Prairie is secretly banned or hidden from you. You can watch every single episode right now if you want to. What has changed is how much context and criticism now surrounds that viewing experience, and honestly, that context makes watching an old episode today a genuinely different experience than it was for audiences in 1975. You start noticing things. You start asking questions the original audience mostly wasn't asking. And maybe that's actually the more useful takeaway here, more useful than any myth about secretly banned episodes. Media from decades ago doesn't need to be hidden to be understood critically. It needs context. It needs honesty about who got left out of the story and why. The real controversy around Little House on the Prairie was never about some shadowy Ben you've never heard of. It was always right there in plain sight, in the books on the shelf and the episodes still airing in reruns, waiting for us to actually look at them honestly instead of just nostalgically. If this kind of deep dive into the real story behind a classic show is something you're into, let me know in the comments what you want covered next. And if you found this helpful, go ahead and like the video and subscribe for more of these. Thanks for watching.